It was a cold, moonless night when Emily found herself stranded on a remote stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere. Her car had broken down, and her phone had no signal. With no other options, she reluctantly stuck out her thumb, hoping for a passing driver to offer assistance. After what felt like an eternity, headlights appeared in the distance. A battered old sedan pulled over, and the driver rolled down the window. He was a middle-aged man with a friendly smile and an air of reassurance. Introducing himself as John, he offered Emily a ride into town. Grateful and shivering from the cold, Emily accepted. John seemed polite enough, making small talk about the weather and local landmarks. But as they drove deeper into the darkness, Emily noticed subtle signs that made her uneasy. The way John glanced at her in the rearview mirror a little too often, the nervous twitch in his hands gripping the steering wheel. They passed a deserted gas station and Emily hesitated, considering asking John to stop. Before she could speak, John turned onto a desolate dirt road that disappeared into the woods. Panic surged through Emily as she realized they were heading away from civilization. Heart pounding, Emily tried to stay calm, her mind racing with fear. She glanced at her phone again, still no signal. John noticed and casually mentioned that they were heading to his secluded cabin for a drink, assuring her it wasn't far. The hairs on the back of Emily's neck stood up as she sensed danger lurking beneath John's seemingly friendly demeanor. As they approached a dilapidated cabin surrounded by towering trees, Emily's instincts screamed at her to run. But John parked the car. In a stroke of luck, the car door swung open and Emily managed to scramble out into the woods. Branches slapped against her face as Emily ran blindly through the darkness, fear lending her strength. She could hear John's heavy footsteps behind her, his voice echoing through the trees, promising that he wouldn't let her escape. Tears streamed down Emily's face as she stumbled upon a hidden trail leading back to the highway. She flagged down a passing truck, breathless. Emily spent weeks in therapy, haunted by the terror of that night. She couldn't shake the feeling of John's eyes on her, the sound of his voice echoing in her nightmares. The police continued their search, but John remained elusive, a ghost lurking in the shadows. To this day, Emily refuses to hitchhike or travel alone at night. The memory of that horrifying encounter serves as a grim reminder that danger can lurk behind even the most ordinary of faces. One evening, as Emily walked home from work, she noticed a familiar car parked across the street. Her heart skipped a beat when she recognized the silhouette of John behind the wheel, staring at her with that same eerie smile. Panic surged through Emily as she ducked into a nearby store, frantically dialing 911. The police arrived quickly, but by then John had vanished once again. They assured Emily they would increase patrols in her neighborhood and advised her to stay vigilant. Weeks turned into months, and Emily lived in constant fear of encountering John again. She installed security cameras around her home, changed her routine, and always made sure someone knew her whereabouts. But no matter what precautions she took, the lingering threat of John's presence haunted her every waking moment. One stormy night, Emily awoke to the sound of footsteps outside her bedroom window. Emily moved to a new city, hoping to leave behind the nightmares that had plagued her for so long. She sought intensive therapy to cope with her trauma, but the fear of John's return never truly left her. Years passed without any sign of John, and Emily started to rebuild her life. She found solace in a supportive community and began to feel safe once again. Yet, she remained vigilant, knowing that the scars of that fateful night would always remain. It was a humid summer evening when Mark, a weary traveler, found himself stranded on a desolate stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere. His car had broken down hours ago, and with no cell service, he decided to hitch a ride back to the nearest town. As twilight descended, a beat-up pickup truck finally pulled over. The driver, a middle-aged man with a disheveled appearance, offered Mark a ride. Grateful and a bit apprehensive, Mark hopped into the passenger seat. The man introduced himself as Bill and seemed friendly enough, but there was an unsettling intensity in his gaze that made Mark uneasy. Bill drove in silence for a while, occasionally muttering to himself in a way that sent shivers down Mark's spine. The road twisted and turned through dense woods with no other cars in sight. Mark noticed strange objects littering the back of the truck. A rusty shovel, coils of rope, and old tattered clothes that looked oddly familiar. Trying to break the tension, Mark asked Bill about himself. Bill responded curtly. As they approached a dimly lit gas station, Mark considered asking Bill to stop, but before he could speak up, Bill abruptly turned onto a narrow dirt road leading into the forest. Panic gripped Mark as he realized they were veering away from civilization. He fumbled for his phone, but Bill noticed and casually mentioned that there was no reception in these parts. Mark's heart pounded as he struggled to stay calm, his mind racing with desperate thoughts. After what felt like an eternity, Bill finally stopped the truck in a clearing surrounded by towering trees. Mark's senses were on high alert as Bill got out and walked around to the passenger side. With a forced smile, Bill offered to show Mark something interesting he had found in the woods. Terrified but seeing no other choice, Mark followed Bill into the darkness. They stumbled upon an old cabin, its windows boarded up and the door hanging off its hinges. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of decay and something else, something unmistakably sinister. Mark's instincts screamed at him to run, but Bill's demeanor had shifted, becoming increasingly erratic and menacing. He muttered about how no one would miss Mark out here, how he had been waiting for someone like him. Mark's mind raced with horror as he realized he was in the clutches of a deranged serial killer. He waited for the perfect moment, and when Bill turned his back, Mark lunged for the door. Adrenaline fueled his sprint through the woods, branches whipping at his face as he ran for his life. Miraculously, Mark stumbled upon a main road where headlights appeared in the distance. He flagged down a passing car, babbling incoherently about what had transpired. The driver, a kind woman, called the police while Mark collapsed in shock and relief. To this day, Mark can't shake the horror of that night, the narrow escape, the chilling realization of how close he came to becoming another nameless victim. Hitchhiking, once a carefree adventure, now haunts him as a reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath even the most ordinary facades. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the desolate highway where Sarah stood. her thumb outstretched in a desperate bid for a ride. She had been on a road trip to clear her mind after a rough breakup, but now her car lay abandoned with a blown tire and her phone had died hours ago. As darkness settled in, Sarah's anxiety grew. Just when she thought hope was lost, headlights pierced the gloom. A white van pulled over, its driver obscured by the dim interior. Relieved yet wary, Sarah approached cautiously. The driver rolled down the window, revealing a middle-aged man with an unsettling smile. "Need a lift?" he asked, his voice oddly smooth. Sarah hesitated, her instincts tingling with unease. But the chill night air and her mounting fatigue pushed her to accept the offer. She climbed into the passenger seat, noting the odd assortment of trinkets cluttering the dashboard, a broken compass, a tattered map, and a faded photograph. The man introduced himself as Richard and began driving without further conversation. Sarah tried to make small talk, but Richard remained aloof, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. They passed through sparse towns and vast stretches of wilderness, the isolation weighing heavily on Sarah's nerves. After what felt like an eternity, Richard turned onto a narrow dirt road that disappeared into dense forest. Alarm bells rang in Sarah's mind as they left behind any semblance of civilization. She discreetly checked her phone, a faint glimmer of hope, but there was still no signal. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, her voice quivering with apprehension. "Just a little further," Richard replied cryptically, his smile widening unnervingly. Sarah's heart raced. She considered jumping out of the van, but the road was too rough and the forest too dense. Richard slowed to a crawl as they approached an isolated cabin nestled among towering pines. The air grew thick with dread as Sarah realized she had walked into a trap. "You shouldn't have come here," Richard murmured, his voice low and menacing. He reached under his seat, pulling out a length of rope with chilling intent. In a split-second decision, Sarah lunged for the door and bolted into the woods. Branches whipped at her face as she sprinted blindly through the darkness, fueled by sheer terror. She could hear Richard's enraged shouts behind her, his heavy footsteps pounding the forest floor. Panic threatened to overwhelm Sarah as she stumbled upon a hidden trail. Adrenaline pushed her forward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She prayed for a miracle, a way out of this nightmare. Suddenly, headlights cut through the trees ahead. Sarah burst into a clearing, sobbing with relief as she flagged down a passing car. A young couple, Jake and Emma, jumped out, concern etched on their faces as Sarah babbled about the maniac chasing her. They called the police while Sarah collapsed in Emma's arms, shaking uncontrollably. Sarah spent weeks in therapy, haunted by nightmares of Richard's sinister smile and the terror of almost becoming another statistic. She avoided highways and remote areas, haunted by the memory of that fateful night. Months passed without any sign of Richard. The police issued warnings, urging caution among travelers, but Richard remained at large, a chilling specter lurking in the shadows. Sarah found solace in support groups and advocacy, turning her trauma into a mission to raise awareness about the dangers of hitchhiking and traveling alone. Years later, Sarah's story became a cautionary tale, shared around campfires and whispered in the back seats of cars. One rainy afternoon, years after the incident, Sarah spotted a familiar face on the news, a mugshot of Richard finally captured after a series of similar abductions. He had been apprehended in a neighboring state, his van found abandoned in a wooded area. Sarah's hands trembled as she watched the report, a mix of relief and lingering dread washing over her. Richard was sentenced to life in prison without parole, but the scars he left on Sarah's psyche remained. She continued her advocacy work, sharing her story to empower others and prevent further tragedies. The support of her loved ones and fellow survivors became her lifeline, helping her navigate the ongoing battle against fear and trauma. In quiet moments, however, Sarah still saw Richard smile in her nightmares, a reminder that some horrors never truly fade away.